I want you to imagine this. Imagine lootings and riots rampaging the streets of this country. Businesses are ablaze. Mass protests sweep the country. People are outraged. They're demanding a change. No, I'm not describing what happened this past summer because of protests for racial inequality and change within the policing community. I'm describing what's going to be happening in the near future if Republicans and Democrats do not help the average American. So, without any more to say, let's look into the stimulus. Before we begin, I think it's important that we take a look at a variety of different factors of what makes a good economy for the regular person. And to begin, we also need to examine the regular person. What is the average American? Well, the average American is the person who works 40 hours a week, makes $35,000 annually, the person who has to put food on the table for themselves, their family, their kids, the person who has $38,000 in debt. That's the regular person. That's the American. That is the average American. But what makes a good economy for them? Well, things that make a good economy for them are a variety of different economic figures, deriving from employment to wages, savings, and potentially even the stock market. But we're going to debunk that later in this episode. So when we talk about employment figures, what we're talking about is do we have full employment? Are we close to full employment? Are people that are seeking to work have a job? When we talk about wages, have wages risen? Have they fallen? Or have they remained stagnant? And when we talk about savings, how much does the average person have saved in their bank account? And when we talk stock market, is the stock market really a good indication like the Republicans and specifically President Trump say it is? Or is it just a reflection of how Wall Street is doing and not Main Street? So to begin, we're actually going to start with the latter and work our way up. So we're going to start with the stock market. And it's my belief that the stock market is really not a good indication for how well the normal person's doing. To start off us on this issue of the stock market, only 55% of all Americans are invested in the market to begin with. And that's according to a Pew Research poll. And of those surveyed, only 22% of people making below $40,000 a year own stocks. Now, as we talked about in Season 1, 52% of Americans make $30,000 or less annually. So this idea that 22% of Americans making below $40,000 own stocks, well, you can only assume that it goes down and down and down. The less income is coming into that person annually. So if they're making $20,000, I'm pretty sure they don't have as much money in the market as someone with $40,000. Because at that point, when you're making $20,000 or $30,000, you're investing it right back into yourself. You're not investing that money right into the market. You're thinking about short term. You don't have the economic luxury to think about long term. But as I said, so only 22% of Americans making below $40,000 are invested in stocks. But again, of those 55% of Americans that are invested in the stock market at all, only 14% are invested directly into the market and are able to collect capital gains right away. 52% are just invested with 401ks. So that's money you're not able to touch until you're older. That's investing into your future. With capital gains, that's only 14%. So it's not a good indication for how well the average person is doing. It's a good indication for how the rich are doing, or how well people with above the median income of $30,000 are doing. But it's not an indication of how well the average American who makes $35,000 a year is doing. So, when all is said and done, as I have to reiterate here, the average American who earns $35,000 a year, frankly, is just not going to be invested in the market. So that's why contrary to what people like President Trump say, that the market is booming and the 401ks are great. And, Democrats do this when they're president or have a majority as well. They say the same thing. I don't necessarily believe the market's a great indication for how well everything's doing. But as I said, there's other indicators for how well the economy is doing. So we can indicate and see how the economy is doing in other areas, such as wages, such as employment rates, and such as savings. So let's go ahead and take a look at employment rates. Well, President Trump did something right. I have to give him credit where credit is due. Throughout his presidency, whether we want to have the conversation about whether or not he was just using the coattails of the Obama economy, or whatever it might have been, President Trump was able to achieve under his administration the lowest unemployment rate in American history. In fact, in February, before COVID hit, we had a 3.5% unemployment rate. Now, whether or not that's actually a real figure or not, that's a whole different discussion. But BLS, the Bureau for Labor Statistics, said that the unemployment rate in February was 3.5%. This past month in September, the unemployment rate was roughly 8%. Now, I'm sure that we can all use our wildest imaginations to determine, well, yeah, Paul, come on, that's from COVID. And yeah, no, I'll concede that is absolutely from COVID. And the highest unemployment rate this year was at 14%. But some of those jobs, according to, again, the Bureau for Labor Statistics, are irrecoverable. According to BLS, 19.4 million Americans who are currently unemployed are unable to work because their businesses have closed permanently. That's 19.4 million Americans who ought to seek a new job in a time where new jobs aren't necessarily available because businesses are not in the right state to make new jobs. They're not they don't have that capacity unless you're, Jeff Bezos, who Amazon, during the pandemic, Jeff Bezos made I think it was him and like three other people, $500 billion in the course of 3 months during the first half of the pandemic. Unless you're one of the owners of those businesses, then you can afford it. But, 99% of businesses in this country are small businesses. Unfortunately, they don't have the capability to hire new people at the moment because they're going bankrupt because the government hasn't helped them. So, when we talk about that 8% unemployment from September, well, that's not necessarily the case for the actual unemployment number. Because when we look at this, those people who lost their jobs, so 19.4 million, are not being included in that 8% figure because their businesses have just closed. Not permanently, but just closed temporarily. Some of them closed permanently, but some of them also closed temporarily. So that 8% figure is very likely higher than it actually is. So that's one of the statistics to look at when we're determining what makes a good economy. The unemployment, the employment figure. But as I said, we also have to take a look at things like wages. How well are wages doing? And again, to give President Trump credit, under his administration, under the past 2 years of his administration, we've seen gigantic spikes in the average wage of the American worker. In 2012, after we were recovering from the recession under Obama, the real median personal income met its lowest point around $30,000. Before the pandemic hit in 2019, so jump back a year ago, the real median personal income sat around $35,000. Over the course of that 7-year period, from 2012 to 2019, we saw a jump of $5,000 in the median personal income per person. But it's unfortunate because the pandemic did hit. And employers were presented with an option. Do I want to fire my staff and have layoffs and lower worker morale that way? Or do I want to lower worker morale by, frankly, having to cut wages and lower wages of the average worker? They decided not to lay people off and instead to cut wages. In fact, earlier this year, back in April, I believe it was, 43% of Americans said that they either knew someone in their household or they themselves had to take a pay cut because of COVID. In fact, marketplace.org reports that 1/3 of businesses in this country are expected to cut wages by the end of this year. 1/3 of businesses. That's incredible. We're going to see some of the lowest wages now because, unfortunately, businesses are going to have to cut. And these wages are already low after having to pay things like utility bills such as water and electric, your mortgages, your car and phone payments, and the bill to put food on the table. The wages are already low after you factor in all those things. You don't have much money to put onto leisure and for leisuring your expense. You don't have much money for that. And with lower pay because of pay cuts, and the government not stepping in to help these businesses with paycheck protection programs anymore because all that money's expired, we're seeing some really gross things come out that people are having to be evicted because they're not making enough money, and that they have to, literally go to homeless shelters to get food and to go to all these different places, these soup kitchens and everything like that. But as I said, we also need to take a look at savings. And this is where we see a failure of the current administration, the prior administration, the Obama administration, the Bush administration, and really just the American economic system. Only 40% of Americans have more than $1,000 in their bank account in case of an emergency. And, as of December of 2019, so about a year ago, only 23% of Americans had enough money to make it past 6 months in case of an emergency. Well, I'll tell you the fact of the matter. We are 7 months into a global pandemic, a pandemic that has shattered the economy. But only 23% of Americans had enough money to make them past 6 months. So you would think and you would hope that the government stepped in. Because as we see, our economic system has failed us. People aren't making enough money to survive. People don't have enough money in case of an emergency. Our economic system has failed us. But surely the political system has worked, right? Surely it has to have worked. Surely our politicians have to have our back. I mean, after all, we elect them into office, right? Wait, no? No, they don't have our back? Oh, okay. I'm just kidding. No, of course they don't have our back. So what would help the American people? Well, first, a stimulus plan for all Americans. If you all remember back to March of this year, 2020, you'll remember that President Trump signed into law a stimulus package for Americans to receive $1,200. But the problem was it was only $1,200, which is crumbs in comparison to what is actually needed to be done, and that it wasn't accessible to all Americans. In fact, if you were the age of 18 and were claimed as a dependent on your parents' tax returns, you were unable to receive the payment. So when you came home from college, because the fact that your college sent you home, you were unable to receive any benefits from that law. You received $0. You did not receive $1,200. You did not receive $500. You received $0. And it wasn't available to Americans who made above a certain threshold. I believe that threshold was $75,000. And that was in part the reason that people received those stimulus checks so late, because the government decided to means test them. But that's not what needed to be done during a pandemic. Americans need more than crumbs. They need more than $1,200. A one-time check of $1,200, that's incredible. Other countries like Germany were nationalizing wages to make sure that workers didn't have to worry about going poor or having to worry about putting the next meal on the table. Other countries were paying people to literally stay home. Instead, we want the economy to open back up in the middle of a deadly pandemic, the most deadly pandemic in over 100 years. Will you believe that? That we are so capitalist-centric that businesses must open up. That's incredible. Only country to actually believe that, to put the economy over science. But that's either near or there. So what would be the solution to this? How do we approach this going forward? Well, as I said, you can't just expect Americans to live off for 5 months off of $1,200. That's an absurd premise. So what do? Well, in my opinion, we need to have a universal basic income system for the remainder of this pandemic. I'm not saying do universal basic income, UBI, as a general rule. I'm just saying do it for the remainder of this pandemic as a temporary UBI source where every American, regardless of income, regardless of age, as long as you're 18 or older, you will receive $1,000 a month. Because that's what Americans deserve right now. They have been put to the side for the last 5 months, been offered zero economic help because of a gridlock partisanship battle in Congress. No, it's the time that Americans get the help that they need. Give them universal basic income. At the very least, cut them a stimulus check. But to be fair, that is one of Congress's proposals, and we're going to get into that later. But what else needs to be done in this country? Well, as I mentioned earlier, Americans are facing an eviction crisis. It's predicted that anywhere from 29 to 39 million Americans will be evicted by the end of this year. Torn out of their house, told to go sleep on the streets. We are the wealthiest nation on the face of this planet. We claim to be number one. We cannot be number one if that is the state of our economy. That's the state of our citizens sleeping on the streets because our government couldn't take care of them during a pandemic, a time where people couldn't work. So what else needs to be done, though? Well, a plan to retroactively help small businesses. Because during the first stimulus check with the PPP loans, Paycheck Protection Programs, corporations and franchises were taking advantage of the funds purposefully laid out for small businesses. The rule that Congress passed was if you are a business that has 500 employees or more or less at a single location, you are eligible for that small business Paycheck Protection Program. That shouldn't be the case. Corporations like McDonald's, Ruth Chris Steakhouse, and Shake Shack should not be eligible for small business protections when their annual income is grossly outmeasured by a small mom and pop shop. That shouldn't be the case. Corporations should be barred from taking small business funds. So retroactively help them turn off utilities bills for a few months. Pay off these companies, pay off the utility companies. Make sure that they can pay their rent. Make sure that they can pay their employees. Make sure that they have the financial resources to open back up when all this is said and done. Don't leave strictly these giants like Walmart, McDonald's, and all these other huge corporations from being the only competition left when the pandemic is over. Help small businesses. They make up 99% of all businesses in this country. But unfortunately, we haven't seen UBI. We haven't seen another stimulus check. We haven't seen a moratorium on evictions. And we haven't seen a retroactive plan to help small businesses. So what have we seen? Well, I'll tell you. Since March 30th, when President Trump signed that law, we've seen nothing. We have seen not a single thing be done by Congress. Why is that? Well, it's in part because of 3 people. Trump, Nancy Pelosi, and the Republican Senate. So I guess that's a variety of different people, not 3 people, but you get the gist of what I'm saying. So let's start with President Trump. What has President Trump said on this matter of stimulus checks? Well, first, he said that he'd oppose any stimulus check until after he was reelected. In other words, it was a bargaining chip. Americans, you elect me to be your next president, and I'll give you money. He was buying votes. But, he saw the stock market go down 400 points literally minutes after he sent out that tweet. So he reversed it, saying that he'd only sign a $1,200 payment, no other parts of the bill. It would have to be piecemeal if he would. He doesn't want everything as one big conglomerate bill. In fact, here's what Steve Mnuchin had to say on that matter.
Yes or no, do you believe another stimulus check could help stabilize the economy?
I do.
However, you've been on record for not supporting the economic package that we passed in May that included another round of stimulus checks for millions of Americans that are right now unable to afford their rent and so forth.
So as we saw there, Steve Mnuchin, who was the Treasury Secretary under President Trump, basically said that he would refuse to sign any other parts of the bill. He wants it piecemeal. Yes, President Trump supports a stimulus, but only a stimulus, nothing more, nothing less. He doesn't support the moratorium on evictions. He doesn't support retroactively helping small businesses. He doesn't support a UBI program. And yes, while I will concede that $1,200 is better than nothing, then we have to take a look at Nancy Pelosi, who opposes doing just $1,200, has a $3 trillion plan that the House passed back in May, that President Trump denies and opposes, that Mitch McConnell denies and opposes, that Senate Republicans deny and oppose. And here's what she had to say on the matter.
I want this very much now because people need help now. But it's no use giving them a false thing just because the president wants to put a check with his name on it in the mail.
When was the last time you spoke with the president about this?
I don't speak to the president. Speak with his representative.
Why not call him and say, Mr. President, let's work out a deal. It's not going to be everything you want, not going to be everything I want, but there are so many Americans right now who are in desperate need. Let's make a deal.
What makes me amused, if it weren't so sad, is how you all think that you know more about the suffering of the American people than those of us who are elected by them to represent them at that table.
You know, she makes this comment, says Nancy Pelosi, whose net worth is approximately $140 million. Yes, she has a great idea of how the average American's doing. But, you know, putting that aside, she said the quiet part out loud. He only wants his name on the check. And while that very well is true, I agree with Nancy Pelosi that President Trump really only supports the stimulus package because of his re-election chances. You know, you claim to work for the American people. You claim to want to help the American people. And sometimes a person like President Trump, you know, a broken clock is right twice a day. You know, help him. Help us. Help the American people. Help the American people get out of this pandemic, even if it's only $1,200. I understand that your bill does much, much more. And I understand I support that bill in the House, the HEROES Act. But we got to look past it. You know, it's not going to get passed. Maybe under a Biden administration, but not under the Trump administration, not by a Republican-led Senate. So, Nancy, help the American people. But as I said, the Senate Republicans also are an obstacle in getting anything passed. And, you know, they're one of the actors in this. And I say actors literally. The Republicans are now gearing up for a Trump loss and are once again deficit mongering. They're saying, how could we afford it? How can we afford to do UBI? How could we afford to do a rent moratorium? The country is trillions of dollars in debt. How could we afford it? Let me pose a question. How could we afford not to do it? How could we afford to see homelessness rise to the tune of millions? How could we afford to see rates of depression and suicide skyrocket because of economic angst? How could we afford to let our fellow Americans fail during these absolutely trying times? Well, we can't. Senate Republicans think we can. Well, the answer is we can't. Or at least we shouldn't. So my plea to these three groups, these three actors, stop playing politics. We're in the middle of an economic emergency, a pandemic, at a time when people are beginning to realize that the government does not work for them. The point of government is to work by and for the people, to establish welfare, to protect the population. We've been ignored during these times of this pandemic and economic emergency because of the ineptitude of our politicians. And if I'm being honest, I don't think they care. Focus on getting people money, not cheap partisan points. Focus on people, not the election. So that's where I'm going to wrap up the first segment of today's show. I hope that you all enjoyed. And I'm going to take a quick commercial break, and we're going to be right back.